The rain lashed sideways against the tall windows of Bertram Academy like it was trying to break in. The wind howled down the stone corridors, rattling old portraits in their frames and sending waves through the ivy that clung to the dormitory walls. I sat alone in the office that once belonged to my mentor, the late headmaster Gordon McLaren. My name is Fiona McLaren. I'm 28, born and raised in the Scottish Highlands, though I'd spent the last 6 years in Berlin, building tech startups and, according to my brothers, squandering the family name. The room hadn't changed much. His desk still had the same deep gouge on the left side from the time a rugby trophy fell on it, and the old glass decanter still sat empty in the corner cabinet like a forgotten relic. I traced my fingers along the edge of the desk, thinking about his final words to me before he passed. Don't let tradition become your coffin. Burn it if you must. I wasn't entirely sure what he meant then, but I understood now. A sharp knock on the wooden door snapped me back to the present. It creaked open before I could answer, and in strode my brothers, Charles first, then Edmund. Charles, 35, always walked like he owned the ground. He had that ex-military posture, chest puffed out, voice that didn't know how to whisper. Edmund, 2 years younger, followed close behind in his bespoke trench coat, still adjusting the silver cufflinks he wore even on rainy days. Both of them had that old money polish, slick, confident, annoyingly sure of themselves. They looked at me like I was a mistake they'd forgotten to fix. Well, Charles said, dropping into the chair across from me without asking, isn't this cozy? They let you redecorate the old man's office yet? Or are you still figuring out which incense to burn? I'm not here for candles and yoga, Charles, I said. You know why I came back. Edmund rolled his eyes. To claim your rightful place among the ruins? Please. You ran off to Berlin to chase virtual coin and vegan protein shakes. This place is real. I didn't bother replying. I just looked at them. They had aged, but not in the way most people do. They aged into arrogance, like it had been bottled and distilled in the wine cellar they now argued over dividing. Charles leaned back, lacing his fingers behind his head. We need to discuss the estate. The rugby grounds are valuable, obviously. That land could finance a new training center. And the wine cellar, Edmund chimed in. There are bottles and they're older than most countries. If we auction them, we can. We're not selling the school like it's a bloody museum, I cut in. Oh, come off it, Fiona, Charles barked. You left. You're not part of this anymore. I clenched my jaw. Dad appointed me to lead the entrepreneurship program. That's not nothing. To appease your feelings, Edmund said, picking imaginary lint from his lapel. Not because you're qualified to run anything outside a TED Talk. I wanted to scream. But instead, I sat back, breathed through my nose, and counted the seconds until the knock came. Right on cue, the bursar appeared in the doorway. Miss McLaren, he said, nervously adjusting his glasses. The call is ready. It's quite urgent. I stood. Thank you, Mr. Fraser. Call? Edmund frowned. What call? The lawyer, I said, walking past them. She's ready to read the will. They trailed after me, their bickering dulled by the echoes of our footsteps through the long corridor. As we passed the library, I caught a glimpse of myself in the glass. Damp curls, plain black turtleneck, no makeup. Definitely not the Bertram look. But I didn't care. In the video conference room, the screen flickered on to reveal a sleek, sharp-eyed woman in a navy blazer. She smiled thinly. Good afternoon, she said. My name is Maureen Byrne. I'm the attorney responsible for executing Headmaster McLaren's estate. Charles folded his arms. Let's get this over with. Maureen didn't blink. Certainly. But I must warn you, there are conditions. I sat down first, shoulders squared. We're listening. She clicked a key. The screen split. Documents filled one side. On the other, a time-stamped video began to play. My father's face appeared, worn but certain. If they think this place is theirs by blood, let them learn what blood really costs, he said. My brothers stiffened. And I smiled. Because I already knew what was coming. And they didn't. Not yet. The room fell into a tense silence as my father's pre-recorded message faded from the screen. Charles shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Edmund blinked fast, like he wasn't sure what he'd just heard. Maureen cleared her throat. As I mentioned, there are conditions. She tapped another key, and the screen returned to her face. Her voice was calm, but there was a hard edge to it now, like steel beneath silk. Per the terms of the trust, the property known as Bertram Academy, its grounds, name, intellectual assets, and holdings, was sold 3 years ago to a private education consortium. What? Charles barked. Edmund straightened in his chair, incredulous. Sold? Without our consent? I waited a beat. Then I smiled. I suppose now is a good time to clarify, I said, looking directly at them. I'm the one who created the consortium. It was a shell company at first, based in Berlin. I used funds from my first acquisition and structured it through several intermediaries. You wouldn't have known to look for it. Charles's face turned a deep shade of red. What the hell are you talking about? I bought Bertram, I said simply. 3 years ago. While you were busy playing alumni godfathers and carving up turf, I was working behind the scenes. The school is now owned by Arcadia Education Holdings. Maureen nodded. Miss McLaren is the CEO and majority shareholder. You're lying, Edmund snapped. I'm not, I said, pulling out a folder and sliding it across the table. All the documents are here. Company registration, board minutes, notarized copies of the sale. This isn't a power play. It's a completed deal. Charles stood up so fast his chair screeched backward across the floor. This is illegal. You can't just. I can, I said, and I did. I didn't need your approval. You weren't owners. You were trustees. Symbolic ones. The actual legal authority resided with Dad. Edmund grabbed the folder and flipped through it. His hands were trembling. You tricked him into this. You manipulated him. I shook my head. He helped me. You think he didn't know what he was doing when he called me to Berlin? He saw what you two were planning long before I did. You wanted to drain this place like a cask of old wine. Charles jabbed a finger at the screen. Then why wasn't this in the will? Maureen remained poised. The will isn't about the school. The sale was finalized well before his passing. The will pertains only to the residual assets, his personal estate, not Bertram. Edmund looked like he'd been slapped. You mean all of this was never yours, I finished. Not the rugby grounds. Not the wine cellar. Not the antique library collection. You were never more than ornamental trustees. Meanwhile, I've been working on a full restructuring. Bertram is going global, satellite campuses, digital academies, startup incubators. You'll read about it soon enough. Charles's voice cracked with rage. You think you're better than us, Fiona? With your coffee shops and app ideas? No, I said calmly. I just don't think you're entitled to something just because you were born first. Maureen leaned in slightly. There's more. Charles threw up his hands. Of course there is. Maureen continued. Headmaster McLaren left a video series. Each sibling received one. Yours will be delivered privately. I already know what it'll say, Edmund muttered bitterly. Maybe you do, I said. Or maybe you'll finally hear him for the first time. The rain outside had softened, but inside the room, the air was thick. Charles sat back down, staring at nothing. Edmund flipped aimlessly through the documents again, looking for a loophole that didn't exist. And I sat perfectly still, letting the silence do the rest of the talking. This wasn't revenge. It was a reckoning. And it had only just begun. The crackle of the fire behind us seemed too loud in the aftermath of what had just been revealed. The meeting room's old floorboards groaned as Charles shifted in his chair, red-faced and simmering with restrained fury. Edmund sat rigidly beside him, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his molars might crack. The folder I had handed them earlier was still open on the table, its contents spilling out like the truth they never bothered to check for. You must have forged something, Charles finally spat. Dad would never have allowed this. You really believe that? I asked, coolly. Then you never knew him. Maureen didn't flinch. Nothing was forged. Every document in that folder is legitimate, notarized, timestamped, witnessed. If either of you had read a single quarterly report or audited a financial ledger, you would have seen the trail leading to the transfer of assets. Edmund's voice was hoarse. Quarterly reports? Are you joking? I turned to him. No, I'm not. Every quarter, you both signed off on operational budgets. Each packet included buried clauses, legal triggers that transferred control bit by bit. Charles scoffed. Buried clauses? They weren't buried, I said. They were there in plain English. You just didn't read them. You were too busy golfing and collecting alumni awards. Maureen opened her briefcase again and pulled out a USB drive. May I? I nodded. She plugged it into the screen behind her, and a video clip popped up. My father sat in the same chair where I now sat, his voice grainy but firm. They think they know tradition, he said, voice laced with disappointment. Let's test if they know trust. The screen went black. Edmund looked like he might be sick. I spent 2 years embedding restructuring language into financial memos, I explained. Language that allowed for a non-traditional acquisition. Language that made it clear, if you signed without reading, you were effectively surrendering your influence. You tricked us, Charles muttered. No, I said. You tricked yourselves. You thought because I wore trainers and talked about equity in education that I was some naive idealist. But I learned from Dad. Every move. Every detail. And he helped me shape this plan because he knew you'd never see it coming. Edmund shoved the papers aside. So what now? You keep everything? We're just spectators while you dismantle our legacy? I took a deep breath. I'm not dismantling it. I'm transforming it. The wine cellar? It's now collateral for an endowment fund. The rugby grounds will host youth tournaments and pay-to-play academies to finance rural scholarships. The library? We're digitizing it. Every antique will support access grants for low-income students. You used our own family's legacy to bankroll scholarships? Charles asked, incredulous. Our family's legacy was exclusion, I said flatly. This school only worked for the top 5%. The rest were ornamental, background characters. Maureen looked between them. You both signed over all legal control. Your signatures are on file. There's no recourse here. Charles stood again, this time slower. You really think this is noble? You blindsided us and dressed it up like altruism. I stared up at him. You were given a seat at the table and you used it to hoard silverware. I'm just making sure the table serves more than two. Edmund rubbed his forehead. Dad used us. He manipulated us into giving everything away. No, I said, softer now. He gave you a chance to prove yourselves. And you failed. You didn't care about the school. You cared about what the school gave you, status, control, nostalgia. Not impact. Not people. Charles's voice shook. So what? We're just done? You expect us to go quietly? No, I replied. I expect you to think about what you signed, what you missed, and how little you paid attention while calling yourself stewards. The room fell quiet again. The only sound was the rain picking up against the windows, steady, relentless. You can fight me, I said. Hire lawyers. Go public. Try to claw something back. But the truth is, you already gave it away. And the people who'll benefit? They've never had a McLaren fight for them before. Neither of them responded. They didn't need to. The silence said it all. They lost this battle 3 years ago. They just didn't notice until today. The storm outside had eased into a cold drizzle by the time we reconvened. I'd given my brothers the night to process. I knew they wouldn't sleep. I hadn't expected them to. They arrived the next morning without the bluster they usually carried like armor. Charles still wore his pressed shirt and wool overcoat, but he looked deflated, like the starch had seeped out of his bones. Edmund didn't meet my eyes. He just walked in quietly, hands shoved deep in his pockets, mouth pressed into a tight line. I stood behind the desk that once belonged to our father. They sat across from me now, not as trustees, not as heirs, but as two men who had no cards left to play. I placed 2 envelopes on the desk between us. This is your new offer, I said. Edmund looked up sharply. Offer? You can walk away, I said. Take the symbolic trust funds that were set aside for each of us. Or, I pushed the envelopes closer to them. You can start over. Charles narrowed his eyes. What do you mean, start over? I mean employment, I said. Real work. Entry level. Edmund scoffed, but it lacked conviction. You're assigning us jobs? Charles said. In our own school? I nodded. Not your school. And yes, this place was always about legacy to you, titles, plaques, family portraits. But if you want to stay here, you're going to earn it like everyone else. Edmund opened his envelope. His brow furrowed. Finance assistant? You'll be working under Serena Patel in the bursary office. She's 27. Don't call her young lady. Charles tore his envelope open and read in silence. Dormitory supervisor, I said, answering his unspoken question. Boys' hall. 14-year-olds mostly. You'll oversee lights out, breakfast duty, and weekend sign-ins. His mouth opened. You're joking. I'm not, I said. You two wanted to lead. Now you'll learn what it means to serve. This is humiliating, Edmund muttered. No, I said. It's humbling. There's a difference. They sat in silence. Neither reached for the envelope again. I let the quiet stretch. There's something else, I added. Your resignations, from your current roles in London, were submitted yesterday morning. Charles blinked. You what? I sent them. With your signatures. They were pre-authorized. You forged. No, I interrupted. You signed blank resignation letters when you applied for emergency funds from the trust 2 months ago. It was in the fine print. You signed without reading. Again. You can't do this, Edmund whispered. I already did, I said calmly. The room felt colder than before. I gave you the choice, I said. Rebuild, or walk. Either way, you're out of the loop until you prove you can work without entitlement. And if we say no? Charles asked. You'll still receive your token inheritance. It won't support your lifestyle, but it'll keep you warm for a little while. You backed us into a corner, Edmund said bitterly. No, I said. Dad did. I'm just the one carrying out his instructions. They stared at me. I saw anger, yes, but beneath it, something rawer. Shock. Shame. A flicker of the boys I remembered, before they grew into the roles the world handed them. You have until tonight to decide, I said, standing. If you want a fresh start, be here at 7 a.m. sharp. Plain clothes. No driver. No watches that cost more than tuition. Charles stood slowly. You're turning our lives into a test. No, I replied. Dad already did. I'm just grading the final paper. Edmund picked up his envelope. Charles didn't. They left without another word. And I stayed there, alone in the office where this all began, listening to the rain tap against the glass, wondering if, just maybe, this was how we'd finally become a family again. Not by inheritance. By humility. It was late afternoon when I called them back to the office. The sky outside had turned the color of damp slate, and the hills beyond the campus looked like they'd been brushed in charcoal. The air smelled of wood smoke and wet earth. I had the letters ready, 3 envelopes, yellowed with age and sealed in my father's handwriting. Charles and Edmund arrived within minutes of each other. Neither spoke as they entered, though Edmund gave me a nod that looked more like a flinch than a greeting. They sat down in the same chairs as before, their movements slower now, less like men in control and more like passengers waiting to hear a verdict. I placed the envelopes gently on the desk between us. They're from Dad, I said. He wrote one to each of us before he passed. I found them in the desk drawer when I moved into the office. He labeled them for the reckoning. Edmund reached for his first, handling it like it might break apart in his hands. Charles hesitated, his jaw locked tight, then snatched his without a word. I picked up mine last. We read in silence. My father's handwriting hadn't changed in decades, neat and measured, like he was always aware someone might one day read it in a courtroom. But the tone was different now, personal, quiet, honest. Fiona, if you're reading this, then my plan worked. Or at least, I hope it did. You always understood me better than your brothers did. You never asked for titles. You asked for impact. That's why I trusted you with the school. I looked up. Edmund's brow was furrowed deeply, and his lips moved slightly as he read. Charles, unreadable as ever, held the letter tightly but hadn't turned the page in over a minute. Charles, firstborn, fearless, and far too proud. You thought control was leadership, but real leadership begins where pride ends. I watched you rise in the city, and I worried that no one ever told you no. This school can't be led by people who refuse to be led themselves. Edmund, your instincts were always sharp, but you used them for gain, not growth. You saw Bertram's legacy as a portfolio, not a purpose. I left you loopholes in those reports to test your curiosity. You failed, son, not because you were careless, but because you were too sure of yourself to double-check. I turned back to the page. Fiona, your role now is not revenge. It is restoration. Do not let their anger become your compass. Let the work guide you. Give them a path back, if they choose to take it. Not because they deserve it, but because you are capable of grace they have not yet learned to offer. The paper trembled slightly in my hands. I wasn't crying. Not exactly. But there was something in my chest, a pressure I hadn't realized I'd been holding. Across from me, Charles finally let his letter drop to his lap. He rubbed a hand down his face and didn't bother hiding the wetness around his eyes. Edmund had turned slightly away from both of us, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the edge of the desk. I don't know what to say, Edmund muttered. You don't have to say anything, I replied. But you do have to decide what kind of man you want to be going forward. Charles looked up. He really believed you were the one to fix this. He believed we could all fix it, I said. Together. They sat with that for a while. Neither protested anymore. The fire behind me crackled softly. I don't want to be the man he described, Edmund said, voice low. Then don't be, I said. You get to start again. That's what this is. Charles swallowed hard. Do we deserve a second chance? I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the desk. Deserving isn't the point. Rebuilding is. Brick by brick. The silence that followed wasn't angry or bitter anymore. It was heavy, thoughtful, human. I reached into the drawer and pulled out a final piece of paper, an outline of the probationary year, including job descriptions, weekly expectations, and something new I'd added at the bottom. A weekly family dinner, I said, placing it in front of him. Mandatory. Edmund looked up. You're serious? I nodded. Every Sunday. No excuses. You show up. You talk. Even if it's awkward. Charles gave a soft, dry laugh. That might be the hardest part. Good, I said. That means it's working. They rose together, slower this time, and for the first time in years, I saw something close to humility in their eyes. Maybe even hope. And when they turned to leave, neither of them looked back. Because they didn't need to. They finally understood. This wasn't punishment. It was redemption. The morning air was sharp and clean, the way it only gets after a week of rain in the Highlands. I stood by the tall window in the new administration office, coffee in hand, watching as two very familiar figures trudged across the courtyard. No drivers. No suitcases. No tailored coats or leather briefcases. Just Charles and Edmund, both in plain jackets and worn jeans, looking like a pair of freshmen trying to find their dorm rooms. They looked human. I stepped back as the door swung open. My assistant poked her head in. "They're here. Send them in," I said. They entered without ceremony. Charles gave a stiff nod. Edmund looked around at the office, my office now, with clean white walls and a massive window overlooking the rugby pitch, and didn't try to hide his surprise. "You redecorated," he said. "It was time," I replied. The silence held for a second too long, so I gestured to the chairs. "Sit." They did. I set my coffee down, then turned to the monitor behind me. I clicked once, and a familiar face filled the screen. My father, recorded months before his death, seated in the very chair I now occupied. "If they're watching this," he began, "then it means the torch has passed, and not to the eldest, or the loudest. To the one who never asked for it." I glanced at my brothers. Neither spoke. "I built this place on the bones of old systems," Dad continued, his voice steady. "And I feared those same bones would be worshipped long after they turned to dust. Fiona, you were always the one willing to question legacy, to burn the playbook. That's why this belongs to you now. And to your brothers." He paused. His voice softened. "Charles, Edmund, this isn't punishment. It's opportunity. If you want it, the world doesn't need more rulers. It needs men who can serve without pride, and lead without ego. I believe you can become those men. If you choose to." The video ended. The screen went black. The silence that followed wasn't tense, it was quiet in the way something sacred is quiet. Charles cleared his throat. He really planned it all. I nodded, down to the job assignments. Edmund looked at me, voice low. "Do you think we can actually do this?" "That's not up to me," I said. "That's up to you." I handed each of them a thin file. "These are your schedules," I said. "You'll clock in, follow protocol, and report to your department heads. You won't answer to me directly. You'll earn your evaluations like any other staff member." Charles opened his, scanning quickly. "Breakfast duty, hall monitor rotations, laundry inspections?" "Welcome to the foundation," I said. "And if we mess up?" Edmund asked. "There's a 6-month review," I replied. "You fail it, you're out. No appeals. No special treatment." He swallowed hard and nodded. I stood, walked around the desk, and offered each of them a hand. "This isn't a trick," I said. "It's a clean slate." Charles shook mine first, firmly, then Edmund. "For what it's worth," Charles said, "I'd rather earn something than have it handed to me and still lose it." I gave a small smile. "Then you're already one step ahead of where you were." They left soon after, walking side by side toward the staff wing. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I was watching strangers. I saw brothers. That evening, as the last light faded across the hills, I stood in the kitchen of the headmaster's residence. 3 places were set at the table. I had cooked, poorly but intentionally, chicken stew, the way Dad used to make it. The kind that burned if you didn't watch the bottom of the pot. At 6:57, there was a knock. They came in without a word. No staff titles. No family drama. Just 3 bowls of stew and the kind of quiet that comes before something new takes shape. I raised my glass. "To the first Sunday," I said. Charles raised his. "To starting over." Edmund smiled faintly and clinked his glass against mine. "And to the only boss who ever made me wear a name badge." We laughed. Not because everything was healed, but because something had finally begun. And that was enough for now. The snow came early that year, softening the edges of the Highlands and blanketing the Bertram Academy grounds in clean white. The rugby pitch disappeared under a field of frost, and the ancient stone corridors echoed with the sharp clicks of boots and the murmurs of students wrapped in scarves. Inside, the school breathed differently now. It had been almost 6 months since Charles and Edmund had started over, and they were still here. Charles had surprised everyone by showing up early every day, always 5 minutes before his dormitory shift started. The younger boys adored him, not for his last name, but for the way he remembered their birthdays, how he taught them to tie ties without making them feel stupid, how he checked the window latches during storms and made sure no one was left out of weekend outings. Edmund, meanwhile, had learned the difference between balance sheets and actual budgets. Under Serena Patel's relentless guidance in the finance office, he had stopped overanalyzing numbers and started noticing people. He no longer corrected junior staffers mid-sentence or scoffed at cost-saving suggestions. The man who once scoffed at spreadsheets and petty forms now helped process scholarship disbursements for students he would have once considered beneath his concern. The change wasn't fast. And it wasn't easy, but it was real. And I saw it most clearly every Sunday. At first, the dinners were awkward, too quiet, with forks clinking too loudly and conversations dying halfway through sentences. We mostly talked about the food or the weather or whatever embarrassing staff story Charles had collected that week. But slowly, something shifted. The silences grew warmer. The jokes started to land. They began asking about my day, really asking. Edmund even started bringing dessert. One night in early February, I found myself sitting in the old boardroom for the first major leadership meeting since the restructure. I was there as head of strategic development, not just the CEO. And across from me, on equal footing, sat Charles and Edmund. This was the trial run. Not just for them. For me. I clicked to the final slide of my presentation. I'm proposing the creation of a new division within BOARDROOM Academy, I said. A social entrepreneurship program. The room quieted. I looked around. It'll focus on accessibility and reform. Students from under-resourced communities will learn how to create ventures that serve public good. Not charity work, real enterprise. Scalable, profitable, with impact. A beat passed. Then Edmund leaned forward. Where do you want us? I blinked. Sorry? We're in, he said. I want to help build it. Charles nodded. Put me on the operations side. You'll need logistics and housing figured out. It took a second for it to land. They weren't just approving the plan. They wanted to build it with me. You'd be co-founders, I said. We'd start with a pilot cohort of 15. Mostly local. Scholarships full ride. Let's double it, Charles said. I'll get the alumni to sponsor the dorms. I'll find matching funds from the BOARDROOM Trust, Edmund added. We've been under-leveraging the legacy donor circle. I sat back, letting their ideas fill the room. Not out of disbelief. Out of pride. These were the same men who once argued over wine cellars and antique atlases. And now, they were planning seed funds for students whose families had never even heard of BOARDROOM. That night at dinner, we sat at the kitchen table with mismatched plates and half-burnt garlic bread. I have something, I said, reaching into my coat pocket. 2 letters. New ones. From me this time. Charles unfolded his first. Appointment letter. Director of Residential Life and Student Wellness. Edmund's hand trembled slightly as he opened his. Director of Finance and Social Enterprise Initiatives. They both stared at the titles. You've earned it, I said. These aren't handouts. These are acknowledgements. Charles looked up. And you? I smiled. I stay where I've always been. The one who started the fire. They laughed, and this time it was full and deep and unguarded. Later, as we cleared the table, Edmund caught my eye. You know, if you'd asked me a year ago where I'd be right now, I'd have said Lake Como or some bank in Zurich. And now? I asked. He glanced out the window, where the snow still fell softly over the school he once tried to sell. Now, he said, I wouldn't want to be anywhere else. The air that morning was crisp and clear, the kind that makes the windows look like they've been scrubbed clean by the wind. The frost had retreated from the cobblestones, leaving the stone paths of BOARDROOM Academy gleaming with dew. I stood outside the old headmaster's office, watching as Charles and Edmund approached, their breath fogging in the cold. Exactly 1 year had passed. 1 year since the will, since the confrontation, since the fire was lit. We had decided to mark the occasion not with ceremony, but with something simple, a visit to the room where it all began. My office now. Our fathers before. They stepped inside with me in silence, as though entering a chapel. The office hadn't changed much in the last 6 months. A few new books. A better coffee machine. The old decanter still stood in the corner, untouched. We sat down together. I clicked open the video file on my desktop, the same one Maureen had played the day of the will. Dad's face filled the screen again. His words, now familiar, still hit like thunder. They think they know tradition. Let's test if they know trust. Charles exhaled slowly. That line. I'll never forget it. None of us will, I said quietly. As the screen faded to black, I turned to face them. I reached for the drawer and pulled out 2 navy folders, embossed with the BOARDROOM seal in gold. Open them, I said. They did. Inside were share certificates, official documentation listing Charles and Edmund McLaren as board advisors and co-leads of the new BOARDROOM Social Enterprise Wing. Each was stamped, signed, and sealed. Charles looked at his, then at me. You're really doing this? No, I said, smiling. We're really doing this. Edmund held up the certificate like it might dissolve. We're board members again? You're partners, I corrected. But this time, you earned the title. Charles sat back, the paper in his hand, a distant look in his eyes. We tried to take it all by birthright. And got blindsided by your little sister with a PowerPoint and a startup lawyer, I added. We all laughed, really laughed. That's when Edmund leaned forward and said, remember when we used to sneak into the library through the side door during holidays? To steal Dad's whiskey, Charles said. Speak for yourself, I replied. I went in to read. Right, Charles said, rolling his eyes. You were the one dragging around that giant notebook. What did you call it? My Big Ideas book, I said, grinning. Most of them were terrible. Well, Edmund said, raising his coffee mug, one of them stuck. To the one that stuck, Charles echoed, lifting his own. I raised mine last. To legacy earned. We clinked mugs. Later, we walked out together, past the old chapel, past the rugby fields now being prepped for the spring youth leagues. The new dorm renovations had begun, funded by alumni who had once written us off. Inside the library, students clicked away on laptops beside digitized archives. The Social Enterprise Lab, formerly the Trophy Hall, now buzzed with first-year students building apps to solve real-world problems. At the far end of the lawn, a new sign stood, freshly installed the day before. The Gordon McLaren Center for Vision and Change. We stopped in front of it. Charles ran a hand over the smooth stone. Edmund swallowed hard. He would have liked this, Charles said. No, I corrected. He would have loved this. We stood there, not as siblings fractured by pride and inheritance, but as leaders reshaped by purpose. What once felt like a battle for control had become something else entirely. A shared mission. A new beginning. As we turned to head back, Edmund glanced at me. So what's next? I looked out over the campus. We keep going, I said. There's still more to build. And for the first time in our lives, we walked away side by side. Equal, whole, home.